thanks everybody for being here. It's a real honor and enjoyable to get to talk about some of these topics that I care a lot about and don't often get to do in my day-to-day job. So we're in the WSP session, so it's much more nuts and bolts than the more kind of philosophical conversation that we had last hour. So we're going to start out. I'm going to just quickly talk a little bit about WSP. I know many of you probably either went to or will go to the general session, but there could be people on who are not familiar with what wilderness stewardship performance is. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. And then how does the solitude, outstanding opportunities for solitude element fit into that? Then we'll just talk about implementing the national minimum and enhanced protocols. I'm keeping my presentation, I think, relatively short so that we can have really ample time for Q&A and discussion, because I imagine there'll be a lot of questions that come up. So where did WSP come from? Well, those of you who are my age probably remember back to the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA, which required federal agencies to have performance plans and measures. Prior to that time, the Forest Service had no meaningful way to nationally report what was going on in wilderness, what they were doing, and how the system was responding. So the Forest Service adopted the 10-year Wilderness Stewardship Challenge as their wilderness performance measure back in the day. So that was great because it was both galvanizing as the challenge to get 60% of wildernesses managed to standard by the 50th anniversary of the act. We saw a tremendous improvement over that 10 years. And also then have something that we could report annually up the chain. So when the challenge was over, then the Forest Service had to come up with something else besides the 10-year challenge. For a while, it was called What Comes Next, but What Comes Next is not a great title. So it ended up being the Wilderness Stewardship Performance. And simultaneously with thinking about this upward reporting performance measures, of course, there was a lot of work going on with wilderness character monitoring on the other side, like what's the actual condition of the wilderness, and work led primarily by Peter Landris to develop the framework that became adopted nationally by all 4 wilderness agencies of wilderness character monitoring. So the focus being on natural, undeveloped, untrammeled, outstanding opportunities, and other features of value in wilderness character monitoring. So these two efforts, very interrelated, keep being carried on in parallel. And so that the wilderness stewardship performance, not surprisingly, then has elements that are divided largely among those qualities of wilderness character, along with a couple of others. So each wilderness has to select 10 elements for reporting on an annual basis out of, I think, about 20 choices. And so you'll see here that the solitude quality is broken out as opportunities for solitude and opportunities for primitive and unconfined recreation. I'm just going to be talking about the solitude element today, but if there are questions during the Q&A, we can talk about the primitive and unconfined as well. So as those of you who do WSP reporting know, every element is scored at, you receive between 0 and 10 points. And for most elements, it's incremental. You do the 2-point phase required before you can get 4 points, before you can get 6 points, and so on. And solitude, the way we're doing it now is a little bit different. It started out that way, as I'll show, but it's a little different from that now. So for the solitude element, what is written is that the wilderness has adequate direction, monitoring, and management actions to protect outstanding opportunities for solitude. This is the initial scoring. Some of you have been around a while will know these scoring rules. I just want to quickly go through how we did it before and how we're doing it now and explain the rationale there. At the 2-point level, a monitoring plan and protocol have been developed that meets or exceeds the national minimum protocol. And we can talk as much as you like about what does it mean to meet or exceed the national minimum protocol, because many locations may have protocols that are more extensive than the minimum. At the 4-point level, the initial scoring was that baseline inventory was completed in all of the monitoring areas within this wilderness. This became more clear later. data no more than 10 years old, and a requirement that data are stored electronically. That's becoming more manageable. Historically, we had a lot of problems with people collecting data, but on paper or in various forms, and not centralizing it and then not being able to find it or use it. At the 6-point level, there was requirement for direction for protecting opportunities for solitude being incorporated into a planning or guidance document. We considered talking about this, having this say the forest plan, but we realized that forests are all over the place, some with forest plans that are very old and unlikely to realistically be updated. So it was loosened to just, whether it's a wilderness specific plan or any other kind of guidance document, just that there's direction that's explicit and written. At the 8-point level, the requirement was more extensive monitoring being completed, typically involving more sampling locations and random sampling dates. And the idea being that you've acquired enough data to permit you to draw conclusions about conditions across an entire wilderness. And then finally, at the 10-point level, the idea was that if conditions were unacceptable, management actions would be taken, or if conditions were acceptable, stable, improving, no action would be needed, and you could still gain 10 points there. An issue here was that you couldn't get to the 8-point level without having planning guidance in a document. And frankly, many wilderness managers were taking action and doing things like, say, designated site camping or something like that without having it in their forest plan, because if your forest plan is 30 years old, it may not have ever addressed it. So it was frustrating for people that they couldn't get points for doing things that they were actually doing to protect the wilderness resource. So after 2018, the scoring rules were changed up to keep an incremental 2, 4, and 6 points, but then to allow these additional 2-point checkboxes so that you could, even if you're only at the 2-point level, you could still have, you could get points if you've got documentation and planning documents, or if you've done some data collection. So the key here, you'll see that I've highlighted and italicized that for the 4-point level, the idea is that you've completed your inventory and selected monitoring areas per the national minimum protocol, which is very explicit about how many areas that needs to be for what type of wilderness. Many of the other things in the scoring didn't change: data no older than 10 years, electronic format, and so on. And then the 2-point checkbox for enhanced monitoring that essentially allows you to draw valid conclusions about the primary use areas in the wilderness. We intentionally excluded low use areas because it's likely, in most cases, that it's not really an efficient use of time to monitor places where nobody goes. Okay, so just a word before we talk about the protocols themselves, a word about documentation and deliverables. It's really important to store the data and in electronic format, and preferably in a corporate database. The Wilderness Information Management Steering Team has done data quality assessments over the years, and one thing that we often notice is that documentation isn't always uploaded, and it's important in that upward reporting to at least make note of where data are stored, where documentation is, and decisions that are made. Otherwise, the data can get lost, or people will be confused about like how the data were collected and so on. So I just have a slide here showing opinion. You all have some good systems for housing data. Okay, let's talk about the protocols themselves. If you haven't been there already, Wilderness Connect is a great resource, and under practitioners, they have all of the toolboxes, and under the toolboxes, the visitor use management toolbox has the national minimum protocol and the national enhanced protocol. The national minimum protocol is called minimum very intentionally. It recognizes that resources are limited for doing monitoring. Monitoring encounters solitude opportunities requires much more time than other kinds of monitoring that we might be doing. And so the thinking was we would recommend a phased sort of approach where the minimum protocol could help you identify places where you need more monitoring or places that really are low enough use that it's not worth spending any effort there. So it is a minimum, and obviously folks are encouraged to do more than the minimum if they need to and have resources to do that. Both protocols focus on encounters between groups as the primary indicator of opportunities for solitude. I'll note that there, in wilderness character monitoring, we also have some other measures like acres away from developments, which are consistent with how we think about solitude of large remote places. But these protocols focus primarily on social encounters. It's not perfect by any means, but it was a compromise of what we could do reliably, and have a decent sense of what is going on in interior conditions. People sometimes ask, what about, can you use trailhead registers or traffic counters? And the reason we didn't do that is, well, first, it's very unlikely that folks could, across the country, could actually install those, but also places with complex trail networks, knowing the number of people who go in a location doesn't always give you a good indication of what's happening at interior destinations. There could be cases, in fact, I worked on one with Mount Hood last year where we specifically amended their protocol to use trail counter data in a low use wilderness that has one major trail that bisects the wilderness and almost no use anywhere else. There it made sense, and we could document a good rationale that we felt was in line with the national minimum protocol. But in general, we didn't require that in this particular protocol. Another really important feature about the minimum protocol is that it does use convenience sampling. Data collected by volunteers when volunteers want to go out, data collected by staff on patrols, not randomly sampled dates. And so those dates may or may not be reflective of the overall use across the season. But it's, again, a compromise recognizing that some data is better than no data. And sometimes that convenience sample data can be very good. Yeah. So how was the minimum? What is the minimum protocol? What are the nuts and bolts in it? So it was based on thinking about typical use patterns in wildernesses, where in most cases use tends to be concentrated and use tends to be near portals. And there are large areas of wilderness that don't get a lot of use, at least in many large wildernesses, not universally the case, but for thinking across the system as a whole, these are typical kinds of patterns. And so it requires you to know first which type of wilderness you are, type 1 or type 2 or type 3. Type 3 wildernesses, they don't have any travel corridors, so this protocol doesn't really apply because the protocol is based around the assumption that there are travel corridors, whether those are trails, most often the case, but sometimes waterways. So that you're mostly going to be dealing with type 1 or type 2 wildernesses, and though they're distinguished based on their level of use, their amount of trail or travel corridor, and you can see the decision rules here. And if you don't know where your wilderness falls, there's conveniently an Excel spreadsheet on the Visitor Use Management Toolbox on Wilderness Connect that actually lists all the wildernesses and describes the data for their use and their travel corridors and so on, and then which type they are. And so the big distinction here is that in type 1 wildernesses, the higher use wildernesses, the expectation is that you choose 2 monitoring areas per opportunity class. And then in type 2 wildernesses, 1 per opportunity class. So the protocol assumes that you've gone through and mapped the wilderness to identify what are your high, very high, moderate, low use. So a low use wilderness might only have a couple of opportunity classes, maybe even only 1, but usually at least 2. And then very high use wildernesses sometimes have these portal areas that are really called out as just, we used to call them transition zones. They're transitions to wilderness. And then like semi-primitive, primitive trailed and primitive untrailed would be classifications that are common in wildernesses that I've worked in. So the idea is that you have actually gone through a mapping exercise, and the protocol provides some guidelines and hints about sort of how to divide up the wilderness, because you want these monitoring areas to be meaningful and manageable. A 1 mile trail is probably too small, but a 20-mile trail that goes past a couple destinations might be too large. So there's thought that goes into to actually zoning out the area. So in the example I'm showing here, this would be a classic wilderness in the Cascade Crest out here. The low use, the really low interior untrailed areas, those are off the table. We're not monitoring. We're just making the assumption that conditions are related to solitude are fine in those. And then what we would do then is choose 2 of the very high use, 2 of the high use, and 2 of the moderate use. So in this example, we would actually have 6 monitoring areas that we would be tracking. It's a type 1 high use area. That's the max that you would have. The protocol, the minimum protocol requires 5 weekdays and 5 weekend days or holidays of data. Again, a compromise. 5 days to represent the weekdays conditions in a wilderness is not a lot of data points, similarly for the weekend. But it takes time. You've got to get somebody out on the ground. They have to spend at least 4 hours monitoring in that area during daytime hours. And ideally, if they're doing campsite occupancy, they are there at least early in the morning or late in the afternoon, early evening to do campsite occupancy monitoring. So it's a compromise in terms of amount of data. The protocol requires, as I said, the relatively recent data and documentation of your opportunity class allocation and rationale for choosing the monitoring areas. And you can choose those monitoring areas for a variety of reasons. I often recommend that if you know that an area is really low use, let's say you've got a parking lot that can hold 5 cars, you probably aren't going to have a problem at that location. If you've got a parking lot that holds 100 cars and it's usually full, you probably have a problem at that location. And you should decide whether or not you need data to demonstrate and confirm that you have a problem. Maybe you want to focus on those areas that are kind of in between. This is a management decision. There's no one size fits all for how you decide which monitoring areas to choose. So it monitors, as I said, traveling encounters, whether you see it, all people that you see or hear during a day while you're in the wilderness, camp encounters, all camps visible or audible from a set up camp. And it's important to look at your forest plan or other guidance, because the minimum protocol specifies these, but it allows you to tailor them for your particular context. So for example, from the White River National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan, they say no more than 2 other parties encountered during cross-country travel per day on 80% of the days. That's their standard here. So if the White River says, well, we mean by party a group of people, then your folks should be monitoring groups, because that's how it's defined locally. If you don't have any guidance, the default for the national protocol is monitoring number of people. It's very easy to do both. And again, you can do whatever makes sense for your particular context. Questions that often come up are whether can you use another protocol? And again, if it conforms to the national minimum in terms of the spatial coverage and the amount of data, the number of days, absolutely, go for it. You've conformed. Yeah. And another question that comes up is, can you add fields to the data form? And absolutely, the whole idea is to make this useful locally. I know one wilderness in California, they added cattle sightings to their form for good reason. Some wildernesses in Montana have added overflight hearing to their form. Here in Region 6, we have adapted the Ranger Hitch Report visitor contact form so that they collect the data that is needed for this, but they also check whether people have permits and whether they're day or overnight, and a few other kinds of things like that. So yeah, whatever makes sense for you. I often say that by far the biggest expense with encounter monitoring is getting somebody out on the ground. It costs next to nothing to collect one additional data field, whether somebody has a dog off a leash or whether they're a day or overnight group. Costs next to nothing, doesn't cost much to do data entry, and data analysis is easy. So yeah, not a problem to do that. Sometimes people ask about traffic counters, and it's not part of the protocol to require them, but it does mention that there are good reasons to use traffic counters in some places. And the reason behind that is if you can establish the link statistically between actual number of people entering a wilderness and the actual encounter rates, say at a lake that's 5 miles in, then in the future, you can use the trail counters as your method of monitoring because you've already established a mathematical relationship. And that's a lot cheaper than sending people out there. If you've made the investment to buy the traffic counter, I know they're not cheap, but they are any more durable, reliable, and provide 24/7 data. So something definitely to consider. Okay, then the last thing I think in the minimum protocol is if you look at the protocol online, it provides some examples of how you can do simple analysis in Excel. We know not everyone has sophisticated software or is conversant in using R. And so this just illustrates, for example, some data we collected at Mount Hood, where literally we're just displaying the number of groups met per 8-hour day across the days that we monitored. And it is important to be able to standardize the data. The protocol talks about that a bit more. But if I'm out for 8 hours at Elk Meadow and Eric's out for 4 hours at Elk Meadow, we need to be able to convert that to a standard unit. And so we out here typically use an 8-hour day. We just take the number of encounters per hour times 8. And so this allows us to see, wow, look at, looks like at weekdays at Elk Lake, gosh, we don't have very many encounters, with the exception of what was going on August 3rd. We might want to look into that. But wow, at weekends, weekends in August and around Labor Day, we were up above 30 groups encountered in an 8-hour day, sometimes as many as 50. And the data also illustrates sort of the kind of reflection that it's important to do when you look at these data, because you see, gosh, we have August 4th and 5th and 11th. Those are all kind of close together in time. September 1st is around a holiday weekend. And then the last 2 data points are late in September after the primary use season. So if I'm looking at these data, my thinking is high use season is probably represented by those August, early September days. And there's an indication that there's, if our forest plan standard is that you shouldn't meet more than 12 other groups a day here, it looks like we probably are exceeding that on weekends. And then the decision is, do we need to collect more data and really confirm that? Do we need to think about some management actions? It's a good trigger to think about, like, what do we need to do next? On the other hand, if I look at the weekdays, I don't know what was happening on the 3rd of August, but it's important to know, like, was there a big festival or something up there that accounts for that spike? Or do we think use is really variable on weekdays? Was it raining on August 6th and 24th? Or were those nice days? If those were nice days and nobody was going there, maybe we don't have as much of a weekday problem. So that kind of illustrates the way I like to think about convenience sample data, is really understand, why you're seeing the signals you're seeing for those individual data points. Okay, let's talk about the enhanced protocol. This came up because, obviously as people start implementing the minimum and you want to move on to higher levels of stewardship, you need more data. The minimum protocol is pretty minimum for a big wilderness. And so the protocol assumes that, first of all, this is an important assumption, that you want to know as a manager what's happening at specific locations. Many of you may be familiar with NVUM, and NVUM is designed to not let you draw conclusions about specific locations, even really about specific wildernesses. And that can be useful for national reporting, but it's not super useful to know, like, for the entire 300,000 acre wilderness, that the average number of encounters is 4, right? Because that doesn't tell you anything about what to do or not do. So the enhanced protocol assumes that you want data for locations, and that necessarily means that we're going to be collecting more data and it's more resource intensive. Absolutely. The protocol also requires that you collect data for areas in which more than 80% of use occurs. As I said earlier, the low use areas, we're just gonna just document. These are areas that don't have trails. They're not accessed by popular trailheads. We believe conditions are fine, and we're not going to monitor them. How do you know where 80% of the use occurs? Really, it's in most cases, it's going to be your professional judgment and logical reasoning. Think about the size of the parking lots and how far people have to drive and so on, and just document your decisions there. The enhanced protocol is also more strict about how camp encounter data are collected. We've definitely found out here anyway, where we're using a lot of volunteers to do monitoring, that a lot of them like to do day trips. So our camp encounter data, even though they're collecting the data, they're often collecting it, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is not ideal because often people are moving around and they don't set up camp until after 5 or 6. So the enhanced protocol explicitly calls that out. I do understand, that makes for a significant challenge. It means in many cases that people need to be on overnight patrols to be able to collect data adequately. The approach to selecting monitoring areas is the same as the minimum protocol, no difference there. And then another big issue is the random sampling of dates, and choosing random sampling. There's some issues in the FAQs about like what happens if you can't hit a random date, and so the protocol itself provides some guidance about like how you can substitute dates. The key thing is we're trying to get data that we know are representative of conditions, and the more you deviate from a truly random sample, the less confidence you have that you're not biasing the data in some way. So what else? I just want to say, what else can you monitor other than encounters? I mentioned before, the acres away is a measure in wilderness character monitoring. The central team documents that. And so that, even though we don't think that's going to change much, certainly in the short run, when we start thinking about the next 50 years of wilderness, maybe acres away from roads is a really good measure of opportunities for solitude. I've talked about sounds a couple times. That does seem like a good candidate for something that you could add to encounter monitoring. And then, maybe there are other kinds of things that you could monitor, and happy to discuss those as we go. So just wrapping up with a few conclusions before discussion. It's really important that when we think about monitoring, we're thinking about consistency over time, that what somebody does next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now is done consistently, so that we know that we're documenting actual change in conditions and not change in somebody's judgment, or they interpreted rules differently. So being really clear with your protocol. If you use the national minimum, it's very explicit about all kinds of decision rules. If you see somebody on the trail more than once, how do you record it? Well, if there's more than 15 minutes between sightings, you record it as a new encounter. It's really explicit that way. If you're using any different protocol or you change any of that, really important to document that. And then I often get contacted by people who are like, do I have to do this minimum? And my always response is, adapt to what makes sense to your context. If you have a good rationale for monitoring groups instead of people, or like the example I gave of Mount Hood, where we ended up deciding to use a trail counter, in a remote, low use area with one trail, it was cheaper all around to use a trail counter that they will also use in other locations, to send somebody out there to, document running into 3 people a day. It's really great that we have baseline data for that trail, because it's an area that may increase in popularity, but it was an efficient approach and well documented. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then we'll see if there are questions. And as Eric said, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We have a fairly large group of folks here, so it's probably most efficient to use the chat function.
All right, I have a question here, and it's giant, so you'll have to let me go through this a little bit. So are there any plans to update the minimum protocol? I've been using the Solitude data for wilderness character monitoring and noticed many areas have more data than just 5 weekdays and 5 weekends/holidays. This means my values will be skewed and generally a lot more weekday data. The protocol states something like at least 5 weekdays and 5 weekend holidays in its language of equal days of equal weekends. Which weekends holidays seems like language of equal days of weekends or weekdays could avoid skewed data.
That is a great question. And I am really glad you asked it, because it gets to the heart of that I probably didn't emphasize enough, is I would never combine weekday and weekend data in a single analysis. I would always analyze them separately, unless you have some good reason to think that there's no difference in visitation on weekdays or weekends. So, the graph I showed literally just showed every day. So it wouldn't matter if I had 10 weekdays and 5 weekend days, because I would be looking at the weekdays and then I'd be looking at the weekend days. So I would not combine them. That would be like averaging, equivalent in my mind to averaging from a high use lake to a low use lake. You need to keep them separate. And so I don't think it's necessary to have equal numbers. Actually, if I was going to make a recommendation, particularly for high use wildernesses that I work with, I'd say collect more weekday data for a couple of reasons. Out here, the season is, let's say, 100 days. 5/7 of those days are weekdays, and only 2/7 are weekend days. So 10 weekend days in the summer would represent every weekend in the summer, which is great if you can do that, but maybe unnecessary. But the weekdays I think are more variable, early season, mid-season, late season. So I would probably disproportionately collect more weekday data than weekend day data.
So I'm going to throw a monkey wrench. It's not a question on the here yet, but it's one that I've been kind of wondering about as we've been looking at visitor use monitoring data from 2020. That we know that visitation went up based on what that data is showing, and that because of that, again, you were even talking about this in your last session, people are adjusting because of the uses. So we actually started to see a little bit more weekday visitation last year. How does that change things in your mind, or is this going to be just a blip?
I don't know. And I'm so glad that we have data for where we do have data from pre-COVID, because, I'll put in another plug for Jason's talk about the Cascade Crest wilderness permit system. I mean, a large part of the justification for that permit system was we had data from the early 1990s. We had data from 2013 or 2000-ish and data from 2016. And we could show people that the number of encounters at Green Lake had increased 500%. It was really powerful to have those data, and whether we'll see that continue, and that was pre-COVID, God knows what it was like last year. And so, I think we often think, oh, it's low use, it's not a problem, why monitor? And I try to remind us all that we're in this for the long run. I've been working in the Cascades Crest for 35 years, and places that never saw any use 35 years ago, and we'd be like, oh, no problem. Now they're just popular destinations, or social media blew up a place or something. So, even if we think it might not be an issue now, I think having the baseline data is so critical. And I do know it's costly, it's difficult. One good thing, I'll put in a plug for using volunteers. We had volunteers collect, hundreds of hours of encounter data for us, and they do a good job by and large. It's not rocket science, right? And they loved the excuse to get out. They didn't have to carry a crosscut or a shovel. Their job was to go out and take out their little notebook and just write down. It worked really well. So, and I do know running volunteer programs takes your time and resources, and not everybody has large volunteer groups like some of the Friends groups. But if they are available, it seems like they really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah, and it hits on a point exactly what Stacy Duke and I were talking about with recreation sites yesterday. Getting that baseline data is critical, even if you don't think it's an issue, because it allows us to be proactive versus reactive. And I'm worried that, based on what happened last year, if it continues, unfortunately, people without baseline data are going to be ended up being reactive. So the next question. Are there any big issues using desired future conditions, DFCs, as solitude monitoring zones, or should solitude monitoring zones be created differently?
I don't know enough. Tell me more about DFCs, how they're done.
So they are a little bit different. It's kind of, and maybe Louis, if you want to come online, if you want to unmute yourself, you can even ask this question directly.
Sure. I'm just pulling up one of my tables from our solitude monitoring protocol here, where we're kind of just still in the development phase, but trying to get some meaningful data. And we use our desired future conditions, which were mapped out in the 90s, to determine, what kind of zone, if it's a high use zone or a low use zone. And then we kind of layer that map and use those as boundaries for collecting solitude monitoring data. I have some definitions here, which I could read, but if you, let's
I
see.
think I think I know what you're talking about.
Okay, great.
Yeah, because right, because we did DFCs, yeah. So the big difference there is I think that the DFC zones are going to be a lot broader than monitoring areas, because you could have like 5 or 6 discrete destinations within a DFC if that's how the mapping was done. So I would suggest subdividing and picking, whichever key destination might be important. And because if you have one zone that has 6 destinations and I collect data at Lake X on one day and Eric collects data at Lake Y on another day, again, you're not going to get that nuance. So like if I had like a trail that went in to, well, take Marion Lake, for example, trail goes into Marion Lake and then there's branching of trails around Marion Lake, I'm going to choose to monitor at Marion Lake, because if conditions at Marion Lake are good, probably all the conditions at the more peripheral areas are okay. So I'd use the national protocol. But if I use it and I say, man, conditions at Marion Lake are crazy, maybe I need to do some more monitoring at a more distant place in the subsequent year. So yeah, thinking that through, just how you're going to use the data. I always like to just sort of think through some, if I found this, what would I conclude or what would I do? And just run through some different scenarios. That helps me to make decisions about what monitoring to do, what zones to do.
Thank you.
I have posted the survey in the chat box. I encourage people to click on the survey, take it, because this will help us with future presentations as well. So this gives you plenty of time to get to that before our session concludes. I actually do not see any other questions at this point.
I pulled the chat up and I see that Vic has a comment to me, but I'm going to say it because I think it's a good one. She pointed out that the wilderness character monitoring technical guide combines weekend and weekday data to generate one value for the index, and that's right. And I'll take a look at that, Vic. It's been a while since I have looked at the actual formula in there. So if it's based on taking the weekday data and taking the weekend data and averaging them and then combining those two values, then it wouldn't matter how many days of sampling you had. But if it uses the raw data, you're right, that would be an issue. That would cause some concerns about how do you know what you're tracking over time. So I'll take a look at that.
All right. Any other questions? We still have about 5 minutes left. I'll leave it open for just another second or two. If anybody has anything, I know sometimes it takes a little bit to type in, so I don't want to accidentally take away your opportunity to ask a question.
I'm always happy to. I realized I didn't put my contact information up on my last slide, but I'm happy to just chat by email with folks if you want to thoughts about. I've done a lot of solitude monitoring. I probably made a lot of mistakes over time and know some things that do work. So I'm happy always to connect with people too, to just talk about your individual circumstance. And that beautiful photo is Three Sisters Wilderness.
Yeah, and I know, this is one of the things I figured out with especially the expanded protocol. There is a lot of wilderness have so many unique issues, especially, I know one of the ones we were talking about last year is one in Montana. It actually has 5 opportunity zones, and the number of survey days that was going to take, and, just things like that. So, there's so many nuances that, if you start to go through those protocols, you may find, especially when you start mapping out your survey days and how, what does that mean to you? That may give you some more questions. So I definitely encourage you to kind of look at those protocols, see what that means to you. If you have any questions, please reach out to Troy I can help as well, not nearly as well as Troy, but I encourage people to ask questions if you have them. And we've talked about this with other measures. The intent is to not make these unrealistic. The intent is to make the various wilderness stewardship performance elements doable, but provide you good information to make management decisions. There's a fine balance there.
Absolutely.
Okay, Troy, I don't see any other questions coming in. So once again, I really appreciate your time on this session today. Wonderful information, very, very helpful for everyone to hear it directly and to go through it step by step. So greatly appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thanks for good questions and good luck with your monitoring.